Some folks say wickedness is a choice. I reckon it's simpler than that. It's a hunger, an emptiness that's got to be filled by hurting something that can't fight back. And I never saw a hunger like the one that left two little girls, twins, chained to a dying oak tree like a couple of stray dogs. The man who found them was named Walton Greaves, and Walton had buried enough of his own life to know a ghost when he saw one. He just never figured he'd find two of them still breathing. The wind that night wasn't just cold, it was mean. It tore through the pines on the ridge with a sound like a woman grieving, and it carried the smell of rot and coming snow. Walton pulled the collar of his worn coat tighter, the wool scratchy against his neck. His horse, a steady mare named Belle, picked her way careful-like through the twisted roots and slick black mud. 3 years. 3 years since the consumption had stolen his Martha. 3 years since the fever took his little boy, Thomas, and left Walton with a silence in his cabin so loud it felt like screaming. He was a man walking through his own graveyard every single day. The trail ended at his cabin, a dark shape against a darker sky. Cold, empty, waiting for him with nothing but memories that cut deeper than a winter frost. Thunder cracked open the sky, a jagged white scar, and Belle shied, her ears flattening against her skull. "Easy, girl," Walton murmured, his voice a low rumble. But his own nerves were pulled banjo-string tight. Something was wrong with this night, wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. It was a deep-down wrongness, a feeling that made the old war wound in his shoulder ache and his hand drift down, almost by itself, to the cold steel of the Colt revolver resting on his hip. And that's when he heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a coyote. It was a sound that stopped the blood in his veins and turned his heart to a block of ice. A child's sob, thin, broken, so faint it was almost swallowed by the storm. He was off the horse before he even thought about it, his boots sinking into the muck. The smell of decay was stronger here, thick and cloying. His hand was no longer drifting. It was wrapped tight around the grip of his pistol. He moved toward the sound, the underbrush clawing at his legs like bony fingers, trying to hold him back. The cry came again, closer now, and with it came something else. A rage, a cold, clean rage he hadn't felt since the battlefields of Shiloh. The kind of fury that burns away every last scrap of fear and leaves nothing behind but cold, hard purpose. He found them under a massive oak, one that had been split down the middle by a lightning strike years ago. It looked like a gnarled, skeletal hand reaching out of the earth. And at its base, two small figures were huddled together. Iron chains, crusted with rust but still brutally thick, were wrapped around their wrists. The other end was bolted, deep and unforgiving, into the trunk of the dead tree. They were animals in a trap, bait left for whatever monsters lurked in the dark. They couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Twins, you could tell by the identical, sharp-boned faces, pale as moonlight on a tombstone. One of them was conscious, her dark eyes huge in her starved face. She stared at him, but it wasn't a look of hope. It was the look of a creature that had learned hope was just another way to get hurt. The other girl was slumped against her sister, unconscious. Blood matted her blonde hair, dark and ugly. They were dressed in rags that might have been dresses once, their small feet bare and blue in the biting October cold. They were more spirit than flesh, but they were alive. And for Walton Greaves, that was enough. The conscious twin flinched when he took a step closer, trying to press herself into the rough bark of the tree, even as the chains bit deeper into her raw wrists. "Easy now, little one," Walton said, his voice coming out like gravel. "I ain't gonna hurt you." Her eyes, old and weary eyes in a child's face, searched his. She was looking for the lie, looking for the trick. She must not have found it, because then she whispered 4 words. 4 words that took the broken pieces of Walton's heart and ground them into dust. "Please," she breathed, "don't leave us." Walton didn't answer. He didn't have the words. Instead, he pulled the heavy Bowie knife from its sheath on his belt. The padlock holding the chains was ancient, the iron weakened by years of rain and ice. He wedged the tip of his knife into the shackle and twisted. Hard. The metal screamed. It fought him. But Walton's grief and his rage made him strong. With a final, desperate heave, the lock snapped. The sound was like a bone breaking in the night. And just like that, they were free. but they didn't move. Freedom was a language they'd forgotten how to speak. He wrapped them both in his heavy wool coat. Lifting them was like lifting bundles of dry sticks and dead leaves. They weighed nothing. He carried them to Belle, one in each arm, and they didn't fight him. They just clung to him, their little bodies trembling like hummingbirds, their faces buried in his chest. By the time they reached the cabin, the first flakes of snow were starting to drift down from the leaden sky. Both girls had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, a sleep so profound it looked like death. Inside, the cabin was a fortress against the storm. He laid them gently on his own bed, the one Martha had died in. He built up the fire in the hearth until it roared, casting warm, dancing shadows on the log walls. He set a pot of water to boil, the hiss and steam a welcome sound in the crushing silence. The conscious twin woke up. She watched him from the bed, those dark, knowing eyes tracking his every move. She was a cornered fox, watching the farmer, waiting for the club to fall. She didn't make a sound. She just watched. He brought her a cup of warm broth, thin but nourishing. He had to hold it for her hands shaking too badly to grip the tin cup. She took tiny, bird-like sips, her eyes never leaving his face. Her sister, the one with the blood in her hair, stirred in her sleep. She mumbled something, a word he couldn't understand, and her hand tightened around a small object she clutched to her chest. It was a little angel, crudely made from a bent piece of tin, its surface worn smooth by the constant touch of small, frightened fingers. "What's your names?" Walton asked, his voice softer now. The girl just stared, blank, empty. Whatever they had endured out there in the dark had stolen their names, stolen their voices, stolen everything. That first night, Walton didn't sleep. He sat in his rocking chair by the fire, his Winchester rifle laid across his knees, and he watched over them. For 3 years, he'd had nothing to protect, nothing to live for. His only companion had been a ghost. Now his cabin was full. 2 broken little angels had fallen out of the storm and into his life, a gift he didn't ask for and certainly didn't deserve, and he'd be damned to the deepest pits of hell before he let anyone or anything hurt them ever again. When the gray light of dawn finally crept through the cabin window, Walton looked at them properly for the first time. The blood on the blonde girl's head came from a nasty gash, but it had stopped bleeding. He cleaned it gently with a warm cloth. Both of them had angry red welts on their wrists from the chains, but those were the wounds you could see. It was the other wounds, the ones hidden behind their eyes, that worried him. The bruises on their soles were deep and purple and would take a lifetime to fade. But they were alive, and in Walton's world, that was where you started. As he was dabbing a bit of salve on the conscious twin's wrist, she spoke. Her voice was a dry, rustling whisper. "Are you going to keep us?" The question hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Keep them? He was a widower who'd lost his wife and son, a man who'd run up a mountain to hide from the world because he couldn't stand the sight of other people's happiness. What in God's name did he know about raising children, especially children who carried a darkness so heavy it was a miracle they could still stand? He looked into her eyes, eyes that had seen the absolute worst of what men could do. And yet, there was still a flicker of something in there, a tiny, fragile ember of trust, just enough to ask that question. And in that ember, Walton found his answer. "If you'll have me," he said, and the words felt truer than any he'd spoken in 3 years. For the first time since he found her, a small ghost of a smile touched her lips. The healing began slowly, not their bodies. The cuts and bruises faded quickly enough with regular food and the warmth of the fire. It was something deeper, a mending of the spirit. They started to follow him around the small cabin, like a pair of lost puppies. They were never more than a few feet away, always watching, as if they were afraid he'd disappear if they blinked. They didn't speak, not really, but they were there, a silent, constant presence. The one who had been conscious first, he'd started thinking of her as the older one, though they were identical. She started helping. She'd fetch a piece of kindling for the fire. She'd set the 2 extra spoons on the table before a meal, her movements precise and careful. Her sister, the one who clutched that tin angel like it was her only connection to heaven, she was quieter, more fragile. A doll made of glass that had been shattered and glued back together. She just watched. Her eyes missed nothing. It was on the fourth morning, as the sun streamed through the window, that the older one finally spoke their names. She was standing by the hearth, watching him shave with his straight razor. Her voice was barely louder than the crackle of the fire. "I'm Mabel." She paused, then pointed a small, thin finger at her sister, who was sitting on the floor, polishing her tin angel. "She's Sybil." The names didn't mean anything to him, but the way she said them, with a hint of shame, like they were a secret she'd been forced to keep, it told him everything he needed to know. "Well then, Miss Mabel and Miss Sybil," Walton said, putting down his razor and turning to face them. He made a show of tipping an imaginary hat. "I'm Walton Greaves, and I am mighty pleased to make your acquaintance." And then a miracle happened. Sybil giggled. It wasn't a loud sound. It was like the gentle trickle of a stream over smooth stones. But it filled the cabin with something that had been missing for 3 long, lonely years. Joy. But Walton knew that peace was a fragile thing, a delicate bird that was easily scared away. A few days later, he was helping Mabel patch a tear in her worn-out dress. The fabric was so thin you could almost see through it. As he stitched, the torn cloth shifted, revealing a small patch of skin on her shoulder blade. At first, he thought it was a scar, a burn maybe, but the lines were too clean, too deliberate. His blood went cold. It wasn't a scar. It was a brand, burned deep into her flesh, an intricate, ugly symbol seared into the skin of a child, like she was nothing more than livestock. He'd seen that mark before, years ago, in dark alleys and on wanted posters. A mark whispered about in saloons and spoken of with fear on the frontier. It was an intertwined snake and star, the sigil of the Crow Gang. But they weren't just a gang. They were slavers, traffickers, men who dealt in human misery. Their leader, a monster named Wendell Crow, had been caught and hanged by federal marshals 5 years back. They said he was responsible for dozens of missing children from towns all across the territory. But cutting the head off a snake doesn't always kill it. Sometimes it just makes the other snakes smarter, more careful, and now their mark was on a little girl sleeping in his bed. That night, long after the girls had fallen asleep, Walton sat at his rough-hewn table. The only light came from a single oil lamp, its flame flickering, casting long, menacing shadows that writhed on the walls. He was cleaning his guns, methodically. The Colt revolver, the Winchester rifle, the Bowie knife that had served him through the war. He moved with a practiced, lethal grace, his hands sure and steady. If the Crow Gang, or what was left of it, was still operating, if they had branded these children, then this wasn't over. He hadn't saved them. He had only delayed the inevitable. Trouble was coming to his mountain. It always did. He thought of Martha. He thought of the promise he'd made at her graveside. A promise to be a better man, to put down the gun, to bury the violence that had nearly consumed him after the war. But looking at the 2 small girls sleeping in his bed, their faces finally soft and peaceful in the firelight, he knew some promises had to be broken. He was making a new promise now, a different one. Whatever evil came hunting for these children would have to climb over his dead body to get to them. And if that meant digging up the man he had tried so hard to bury, then so be it. Some fights you don't get to choose. They choose you. A week passed, a week of tense, watchful peace. The supplies started to run low. Flour, salt, coffee. Walton knew he couldn't put it off any longer. He had to go to town. The town was called Redemption Creek. It sat down in the valley, a dusty collection of false-fronted buildings. He'd avoided the place ever since Martha's funeral. He couldn't stand the pitying looks from the townsfolk, the well-meaning questions that felt like rubbing salt in a wound. But the girls needed things. Real clothes, not rags. Shoes that fit their small, bruised feet. Medicine. Things that would see them through the coming winter. "We're going to town," he announced over breakfast. The girls looked up from their porridge, their eyes wide. "You'll stay close to me. You don't talk to anyone. Understand?" They both nodded, their faces solemn. They had learned to read his moods, to sense the tension that had settled deep in his bones. The ride down the mountain took 2 hours. 2 hours for doubt to creep into Walton's mind. What would people say? A broken-down hermit riding into town with two strange, silent children. The rumors would spread like wildfire. They started at Morrison's General Store. Old Mrs. Morrison, a woman with a face like a dried apple, took one look at the girls, and her usual suspicious scowl melted away. "Lord have mercy, Walton," she breathed, her eyes taking in their thin faces, their patched-up clothes. "Where on earth did you find these little angels?" "Woods east of my place," Walton said, his voice flat. "They needed help." It was a simple answer, but in a town like Redemption Creek, simple answers were just seeds for complicated rumors. By the time they'd bought shoes from the cobbler and two simple, sturdy dresses from the seamstress, the whole town was whispering. The Graves hermit had lost his mind. He'd stolen two children. He was holding them captive up on his mountain. And that's when Sheriff Reuben Malloy found them. Malloy was a decent man, as far as lawmen went, but he carried the weight of his badge like a sack of stones, and sometimes it made him see criminals where there were only broken people. "Walton," he said, his voice low. He was standing in the doorway of the general store, blocking the light. "Heard you had some visitors." "Not visitors," Walton replied, his voice cold and steady. "Family." Malloy's eyebrows shot up. "Family? These girls got kin somewhere, Walton. Someone's got to be looking for them." Walton looked the sheriff dead in the eye. "If anyone was looking for them, Reuben, they wouldn't have been chained to a tree and left to die." The word chained hung in the air like gunsmoke. Mrs. Morrison gasped behind the counter. A couple of ranchers who'd been examining harnesses stopped and turned to stare. "Chained?" Malloy's voice dropped to a whisper. "Dear God, Walton, you're sure? I cut the iron off their wrists myself." The sheriff looked at the girls then, really looked at them. He saw the faint scars on their wrists. He saw the way they pressed themselves against Walton's legs, like he was the only solid thing in a world that was trying to sweep them away. His expression softened, but the law was still there, hard and unyielding in his eyes. "There's channels for this sort of thing," he said, his voice firm again. "The orphanage in Denver, the sisters down in Colorado Springs. They know how to handle—" He trailed off, not wanting to say the word damage. "They don't need a channel," Walton interrupted, his voice sharp, making the ranchers take a step back. "They need to feel safe. They need someone who won't abandon them. They need a father." The word surprised him as much as it did the sheriff. Father. He'd been one, for 2 short years. The title felt strange on his tongue, but it also felt right. Malloy studied him for a long, silent moment. He'd known Walton for years. He knew what he'd lost. "You know what you're taking on, Walton? 2 girls all alone up on that mountain. What happens when winter sets in for real? What happens if they get sick? Or when trouble comes looking for them?" Walton finished for him. "Same thing that always happens, Reuben. We face it." The sheriff let out a long, slow breath. He nodded. "All right, Walton, for now. But be careful. Children chained to trees. That ain't just random meanness. That's a message. And messages usually have a sender who expects a reply." As they walked back to the wagon, their new supplies bundled in their arms, Mabel slipped her small, cold hand into Walton's rough palm. "Are we really family now?" she asked, her small voice full of a fragile hope that was almost painful to hear. Walton looked down at her upturned face. He looked at Sybil, walking beside him, clutching her tin angel, her new shoes making a soft clicking sound on the boardwalk, and he felt something inside his chest crack open. Not with pain this time, but like ice breaking up on a river in the first thaw of spring. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick. "We're family." He was so focused on them, he didn't notice the man standing in the shadows of the alley across the street. A man in a dark coat, with eyes that watched them with a cold, predatory stillness. He didn't see the man turn and walk away, heading for the telegraph office. He didn't know that the message had already been sent. Winter arrived like an invading army, bearing the mountains under a heavy blanket of white. But inside Walton's small cabin, it was warm. A real home was taking shape. Routine settled in as naturally as breathing. Mabel discovered a knack for cooking, her small hands surprisingly deft with the dough for their morning biscuits. Sybil, who had been so silent, started to read. Walton had bought a few primers in town, and she devoured them, her finger tracing the words as she sounded them out, her voice growing stronger every day. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire. Walton would whittle, carving small animals out of scraps of wood. A deer for Mabel, a wolf for Sybil. The girls would draw on pieces of slate, their silence comfortable now, filled with the crackle of the fire and the scrape of chalk on stone. One night, Sybil was struggling with a word in her reader. She looked up at him, her brow furrowed in concentration, and then she said it. Pa? What does melancholy mean? The whittling knife fell from Walton's hand and clattered onto the floorboards. Pa. He stared at her, unable to speak. He could feel tears, hot and sudden, welling in his eyes and streaming down his weathered cheeks. Both girls looked at him, their faces filled with concern. It means sad, he finally managed to say, his voice choked. A deep down, bone-deep kind of sad. Sybil nodded, her expression serious. Like we were, at the tree. Yeah, Angel, he whispered, like that. Mabel got up from her stool and walked over to him. She patted his shoulder with a solemn gravity that was far too old for her years. But we're not melancholy anymore, Pa. And she was right. They weren't. For the first time since he'd laid Martha and Thomas in the cold ground, Walton felt something other than grief. He felt alive, as if these two small, broken girls had breathed their own resilient spirits back into his hollowed-out chest. That feeling of peace lasted for 3 more days. He was outside splitting firewood. The air was crisp and cold, his breath pluming in front of him. Belle let out a warning nicker from the corral. Walton straightened up, the axe handle smooth and familiar in his grip, and looked down the trail. A lone rider was approaching through the falling snow. The man sat his horse with an arrogant ease, as if he owned the mountain and everything on it. He wore a long black duster and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Even from a distance, Walton could feel the menace coming off him, like heat from a stove. Before the stranger even got close enough to speak, Walton knew. He knew who this was. The resemblance to the old wanted posters was there, in the cruel set of his mouth, the cold emptiness of his eyes. It was Wendell Crow's son. You'd be Greaves, the man said. It wasn't a question. He dismounted, his movements smooth and predatory. He was younger than his father had been, maybe 30, but he had the same aura of casual violence. I would, Walton said, not moving from his spot by the woodpile. He didn't lift the axe, but he didn't put it down either. And you'd be trespassing. The man laughed. It was a sharp, ugly sound, like glass breaking. Name's Wendell Crow, Jr., but most folks just call me Junior. I've come for what's mine. There's nothing here that belongs to you. Crow Jr., his smile vanished. Those girls do. They bear my father's mark. That makes them Crow property. I'm just here to collect. Walton glanced toward the cabin. He could see Mabel's small face pressed against the window pane, her eyes wide with a terror he thought he'd banish forever. Sybil was standing behind her, clutching her tin angel so tightly her knuckles were white. The nightmare had found them. They aren't property, Walton said, his voice dangerously quiet. They're my daughters. Daughters? Crow Jr. spat the word out like it was poison. They're merchandise. My old man had them trained for a specific purpose, branded and broken proper. Cost my organization a considerable sum to prepare them. Trained? Prepared. The words hit Walton like punches, stealing his breath, making his vision swim with red. He could feel the man he had buried stirring inside him, clawing its way to the surface. I'm here to take them back, Crow Jr. continued, his hand drifting down to rest on the butt of his pistol. So you can either hand them over nice and easy, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice, old man. There's no choice to make, Walton said, his knuckles white on the axe handle. You're not taking them. Crow Jr. just smiled that cold, dead smile again. Think about it, Greaves. I know who you are. I know what you did in the war. But you're one man. I've got 5 more waiting just down the trail. You can't win this. He turned to leave, then paused. I'll be back tomorrow, at dawn. You have until then to make the smart choice. He swung himself up onto his horse, but before he rode away, he reached into his saddlebag and tossed something into the snow at Walton's feet. It was a small, crudely made object, a little angel, fashioned from a bent piece of tin. Except this one wasn't worn smooth from loving hands. It was new, and it was stained with something dark, fresh blood. That night the cabin was silent again, but this time it was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with fear. The girls sat on the hearth, huddled together under a blanket, their faces pale. Walton sat across from them at the table. He laid it out for them, plain and simple. He told them about the men who were coming. He told them what those men wanted, and then he gave them the choice. "We can run," he said, his voice low and even. "We can pack up what we can carry right now. Head for Denver, a big city. It'd be easier to get lost there, to hide." Mabel looked at Sybil. Sybil looked back at her. A whole conversation passed between them without a single word. Then Mabel looked at Walton, and her small chin was set with a stubbornness that reminded him so much of Martha. "They want to take us back," Sybil whispered, her voice trembling. "To the dark place." "Not while I'm breathing," Walton promised, his voice a raw growl. "This is our home now," Mabel said, her voice small but firm. "We're not running." Walton looked from one determined little face to the other. He saw the terror in their eyes, yes, but underneath it there was something else, something hard and unbreakable, something that had been forged in the fires of a hell he could only imagine. "If we stay," he said softly, "there's going to be a fight, a bad one." "We stay," Mabel repeated. "We fight." And looking at them, these two little girls who had survived being chained to a tree, who had survived the brand of evil men, who had survived a darkness that would have shattered most grown folks, Walton felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Pride. "All right then," he said, and he felt a slow, cold smile touch his own lips. "We fight." Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the cabin, and somewhere deep in the woods, a pack of wolves began to sing their ancient, hungry song of blood and snow. The night was long. There was no sleep. There was only preparation. Walton pulled out the heavy wooden shutters he'd built for the windows years ago and barred them from the inside, plunging the cabin into a dim, fortress-like gloom. He checked his ammunition. He had enough, barely. The girls didn't cry. They didn't complain. They worked. And Walton started to see something strange. "Pa," Mabel said, her voice quiet in the tense silence. "The floorboards by the hearth, they're loose." She was right. He'd never noticed. She showed him how one of the boards could be pried up, revealing a small dark space underneath, a root cellar he never knew existed. "How did you know about that?" he asked. Mabel just shrugged. "We learned to look for places to hide." Then it was Sybil. As Walton was planning his lines of sight from the windows, she touched his arm. "The creek bed behind the barn," she whispered. "It's deep. Someone could sneak up that way without being seen." He stared at her. She was right again. It was a blind spot, a fatal one. It slowly dawned on him. That sick, chilling phrase Crow Jr. had used, trained and prepared. He had thought it meant something monstrous, something unspeakable, and it did. But it also meant this. They had been taught to survive, to see the world as a battlefield, to identify weaknesses, scapegoats, hiding places. The monsters who had branded them had, in their cruelty, accidentally forged them into soldiers. They were not just victims. They were survivors. And tonight, they were his partners. He hid them in the root cellar just before the first hint of gray light touched the sky. He wrapped them in every blanket he owned, with a canteen of water and a small bag of dried biscuits. Before he lowered the floorboard back into place, Sybil grabbed his hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You come back, Pa," she said, her eyes fierce in the lantern light. "You promised. We're family." "I always keep my promises, Angel." He settled himself at the front window, peeling back a tiny corner of the shutter. His Winchester felt cool and solid in his hands. He watched the tree line, his breathing slow and steady. The world was silent, holding its breath. And then they came. 6 of them, moving through the pre-dawn mist like wraiths. They spread out, a practiced, disciplined formation, circling the cabin. Crow Jr. was at the front, a dark silhouette on his dark horse. "Greaves!" His voice cut through the cold air. "Time's up. Send out the girls, and I'll let you die quick." Walton's answer was the crack of his rifle. The shot echoed across the valley like the wrath of God. The rider on the far left was thrown from his saddle, a puppet with its strings cut. And then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Bullets tore into the log walls of the cabin, splintering wood, shattering the last remaining pane of glass in the window. Walton moved from one shuttered window to the next, a grim, deadly phantom in the gloom. He didn't waste shots. Each one was aimed. Each one was meant to count. Another rider went down, clutching his shoulder and screaming. But there were too many. They set fire to his barn. The flames roared to life, orange and yellow against the gray sky, eating the dry wood, sending a pillar of black smoke into the air. They were using the smoke as cover, creeping closer, their shots becoming more accurate, more deadly. A bullet punched through the heavy oak door, missing Walton's head by inches. Another slammed into the wall right where his heart had been a second before. He was pinned down. They were closing in. He was running out of time, running out of ammunition. And that's when the floorboard behind him creaked open. Mabel scrambled out of the darkness, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes burning with a cold fire. In her small hands she held his old army Colt, the one he kept in a chest under his bed. It was huge in her grip, but she held it steady. "The woodpile," she said, her voice calm and clear over the din of the gunfire. "There's one by the woodpile." Walton spun, peered through a crack in the back wall, and saw him. A man was using the woodpile as cover, creeping up on the cabin's blind side. Walton fired the Winchester. The man dropped without a sound. She had saved his life. But the respite was brief. The fire from the barn was spreading, embers carried on the wind landing on the cabin's dry roof. Smoke started to seep through the rafters, making his eyes water, his lungs burn. "It's over, Greaves!" Crow Jr. shouted from outside. "Come on out, or you can burn in there with them." Walton looked at Mabel, standing there with that massive pistol. He could hear Sybil coughing from the cellar below. He had a choice to make: die in a burning box or die in the snow. He was done being hunted. "Stay here," he ordered Mabel. "Don't open that cellar unless it's me. Anyone else comes through that door, you shoot them. You understand?" She just nodded, her face grim. A soldier receiving her orders. Walton slipped out the back window, a ghost disappearing into the choking smoke. The heat from the burning barn was intense. The world was a chaotic nightmare of smoke and fire and the crack of rifles. He moved through it using skills he had learned in another lifetime, on battlefields where death was the only constant. He became the man he had tried to bury. The first of Crow's men never saw him coming. Walton's knife slid between his ribs, silent and efficient. He caught the man before he fell, lowering him gently to the ground. The second one managed a strangled gasp before the blade opened his throat. Crow Jr. must have sensed something was wrong. "Report!" he yelled. "Where's Jed? Carlos?" The only answer was the roaring of the fire. "Looking for me?" Walton stepped out of the swirling smoke, his Winchester leveled at Crow Jr.'s chest. Crow Jr. spun, his own pistol clearing its holster with blinding speed. For a heart-stopping second, they faced each other, two men at the end of their separate roads, the burning barn casting them in a hellish light. "You killed my father," Crow Jr. snarled. "Your father dealt in the flesh of children," Walton replied, his voice a low growl. "I just balanced the books. Now I'm here to finish the accounting." They fired at the same time. A searing pain tore through Walton's side. He staggered, but his own shot flew true. It hit Crow Jr. square in the chest, spinning him around like a child's top. He crashed to his knees in the snow, his pistol falling from his limp hand. Blood, dark and shocking, spread out from under him, melting the snow. "This won't end it," he gasped, blood bubbling on his lips. "There are others. The organization." "Let them come," Walton said, walking forward, ignoring the fire that was now licking at his own leg. "I'll be waiting." Crow Jr. collapsed face first into the blood-soaked snow, His father's name a dying curse on his lips. The shooting stopped. The only sound was the roar of the fire and the whisper of the falling snow. The cabin door creaked open. Mabel and Sybil emerged, small figures stepping out of the smoke and into the carnage. They ran to him, their eyes wide, checking him for wounds, their small hands surprisingly gentle. "We're okay, Pa," Mabel said, her voice shaking, trying to convince herself as much as him. "We're all okay." Walton looked at the bodies scattered in the snow. He looked at his barn, now a roaring inferno. He looked at his cabin, riddled with bullet holes, smoke pouring from the roof. Okay wasn't the right word, but he pulled them close, one under each arm, and held on tight. They were alive. They were together. "We'll rebuild," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Whatever they burn, we'll build it back, stronger." And as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a golden, holy light over the valley, the Greaves family, forged in fire and blood, stood together in the ruins and began once again the long, hard work of healing. Spring came late that year, but it came. It washed the blood from the snow and coaxed new life from the scorched earth. And it brought people. News of the fight on Graves Mountain had spread through the valley. They called it a battle, a siege. Sheriff Malloy, when he rode up to survey the damage, had just called it justice. He didn't ask too many questions about the bodies. He just organized a burial party and declared the case closed. Then something unexpected happened. The people of Redemption Creek, the ones who had whispered about the crazy hermit on the mountain, started riding up the trail, not with suspicion, but with hammers and lumber and sacks of nails. They came to help him rebuild the barn. They brought food. Mrs. Morrison from the general store brought new dresses for the girls and a bottle of whiskey for Walton. They had seen the brand on Wendell Crow Jr. His dead men. They knew the stories, and they finally understood. Walton Greaves wasn't a monster. He was a protector. "Funny how things change," Sheriff Malloy said one afternoon, watching a half-dozen men hoist a new beam into place on the barn's frame. "Things don't change, Reuben," Walton said, wiping sweat from his brow. "People just finally see what was there all along." The girls were changing too. The haunted, hunted look was gone from their eyes. It had been replaced by a quiet confidence. They laughed now, real childish laughter that echoed in the valley. They worked alongside the men, carrying water, fetching tools, no longer afraid. They belonged. One evening, as the three of them sat at the supper table in the repaired cabin, Sybil put down her fork. "Pa," she said, her voice serious, "can we choose new names?" The question took Walton by surprise. "You don't like Mabel and Sybil?" "They're fine names," Mabel said quickly. "But they were our names in the dark place. They belonged to the girls we were before." Walton understood completely. Those names carried the weight of their past, the pain, the fear. They wanted to shed those old skins and be reborn. "What names were you thinking of?" he asked gently. Sybil answered immediately, her face lighting up. "Grace." Mabel thought for a moment longer, her expression thoughtful. "Hope," she said finally. "I think I'd like to be Hope." Grace and Hope. Walton looked at the two incredible, resilient children who had brought both of those things back into his shattered life. He couldn't think of two more perfect names. "Grace and Hope Greaves it is," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome to the family, ladies." Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Walton walked out to the small, fenced-off plot behind the cabin. 3 wooden crosses stood there. Martha, little Thomas, and a new one he had put up after the fire. It didn't have a name. It just had a few words carved into it. "The man I used to be." He'd buried that man, the hollowed-out, grieving hermit, in the ashes of the old barn. "Thought you'd like to know, Martha," he said quietly to his wife's grave. "We're not alone anymore. We've got 2 daughters now, brave and strong. You'd love them." The wind whispered through the pines, and for a moment he could almost hear her voice on it. "Take care of them, Walton. Take care of each other." And he intended to, for the rest of his life. 2 years passed, 2 years of peace. Grace grew tall and strong, as comfortable on a horse as Walton himself. Hope became the scholar of the family, reading every book they could find, her journal filled with stories she wrote herself. They were healing. They were happy. But Walton never let himself get too comfortable. He knew that the snake that was the Crow organization had more than one head. Sooner or later, someone else would come looking. That someone arrived on a crisp autumn morning. He wasn't a thug like Junior. He was a U.S. Marshal, a man named Clay Davidson, with a square jaw and honest, tired eyes. "Mr. Greaves," he said, tipping the brim of his hat, "I'm investigating the disappearance of Wendell Crow, Jr., and 5 of his associates, last seen heading this way." Walton didn't flinch. "They were here. They left after I made it clear they weren't welcome." "And where might they have gone?" "Didn't ask. Didn't care." Davidson's gaze drifted to the porch, where Grace and Hope were watching, their faces cautious. "Those wouldn't happen to be the Crenshaw twins, would they? Missing from a settlement out of Kansas for almost 4 years." Walton felt every muscle in his body go rigid. "Their names are Grace and Hope Greaves. They're my daughters." "Legally adopted?" the marshal asked, his eyes sharp. "Morally adopted," Walton countered. "Sometimes that matters more." Marshal Davidson was silent for a long time. He looked at the new barn, standing strong and proud. He looked at the well-tended garden. He looked at the 2 girls who were no longer gaunt and terrified, but healthy and safe. Loved. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer. "The Crow organization, or as some call them, the Children of the Carrion Star. They were involved in some terrible things, Mr. Greaves. We've been hunting them for a decade." He sighed, a weary sound. "If those girls were caught up in that trade—" "They're not caught up in anything anymore," Walton said firmly. "They're just children, with a father who loves them and a home where they're safe." Davidson nodded slowly. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Officially," he said, looking Walton straight in the eye, "the Crenshaw twins were never found. My report will state that Wendell Crow Jr. and his men likely crossed the border into Mexico and disappeared. It was a gift, an act of true justice from a man of the law." "Much obliged, Marshal," Walton said quietly. "Just take care of those girls, Mr. Greaves," Davidson said, putting his hat back on. "The world has given them enough darkness to last 10 lifetimes." After the marshal rode away, Hope came up to Walton, holding her journal. "I wrote a story for you, Pa." She opened it to a page filled with her neat, careful handwriting. Once there was a broken man who lived on a sad mountain. One day he found 2 lost girls who needed saving. But the secret was, when he saved them, they were really saving him. The broken man became a father, the lost girls became daughters, and they learned that family isn't something you're born with. It's something you build. And the best ones are built with love. The simple words hit Walton harder than any bullet ever could. That night, the first snow of a new winter began to fall, dusting the world in a clean, quiet white. Inside the warm cabin, a fire crackled in the hearth. Grace was whittling a new angel. Hope was reading her latest story aloud. Grace looked up from her work. "Pa, are you happy?" The question was so direct, so honest. "Before we came, you were so sad," she continued. "We could tell. But now you smile," Hope finished for her. "Real smiles, not the pretend kind." Walton looked at his daughters, his family. They had walked out of a nightmare and brought him back into the light. They had given him a reason to fight, a reason to live, a reason to be a better man. They had given him hope. They had given him grace. "Yeah," he said, and his own real smile spread across his face. "I'm happy." He had learned that redemption isn't something you find at the bottom of a bottle or in the lonely silence of a mountain. Sometimes it finds you. Sometimes it comes in the form of 2 small hands slipping into yours and 2 brave voices learning to call you Pa. If this story grabbed a hold of your heart, do us a favor and hit that thumbs up button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want to hear more stories about the darkness that people face and the light they find in each other, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we have coming next.